Hello, good afternoon, and a warm welcome back on the thematic strand and the panel on addressing inequalities enabling climate action. We were meant to start this panel with a video message or a video link participation by Dubravka Šuica, who's the Vice President for Democracy and Demography at the European Commission. She is still caught in transit. Her plane has a delay, but she will join us after the conversation. So that means, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to you today's panelists. And please welcome with me on stage Clover Hogan, founder of Force of Nature, Diana Nabiruma, Senior Communications Officer at the African Institute for Energy Governance. Diana, are you with us? Not yet, but I hope she'll join us in a second. Jeroen, Schokkenbroek, the Director of Equal Rights and Dignity at the Council of Europe. Very warm welcome, thanks for being here. As well as Elena, Kountouri, Tapiero, the Regional Representative for Europe at the OHCHR. I stumble upon it every single time. Thanks for taking the time and for being here. As we are still waiting for Diana, I will still go into the description of our conversation, and then we can maybe delve into it together in a second. So the panel is on addressing inequalities and enabling climate action, two fields that are inherently entangled, also interconnected, and dealing with climate change and social justices requires us to rethink our socio-economic models of operating and actively addressing inequalities and its causes, both in Europe but also globally. And therefore, the idea is to address the redefinition of financial, economics, and governance models that contribute to climate change on the one hand, but also to the ongoing creation of social inequality on all different levels. We're going to talk about the carbon inequality gap, and we'll try to propose actionable recommendations to effectively tackle those inequalities, to foster inclusion and to promote sustainability and bolster society's resilience. So the question is also on an educational level, on a level of knowledge transfer, on an intergenerational exchange level, how to engage climate activists and civil society in our models of policymaking, of action and behavior, and we have some experts with us on that, so I'm very much looking forward to examine inclusive participation in decision-making as well. So as we're talking about the activism in relation to politics and policymaking, I would very much like to start with you, Clover Hogan. You're the founder of an institution called Force of Nature. We just had a conversation at the Marketplace of Connections talking about the intersection of mental health and climate justice, and also how that translates into action in relation to major companies and policymaking. We were talking about regulatory mechanisms, but maybe you want to, like, two steps back, want to elaborate on that very intersection between climate action and social justice. How do they even intersect? Why are we talking and thinking about them together? And if we do not yet do so, why should we?
Sure, thank you. Also, do you want to sit here? I don't smell, I promise.
I hope Diana is still going to find us, but
yes.
We'll start the conversation due to the schedule.
Amazing.
I was following instructions.
So I think many of us have heard this idea that the climate crisis is a product or a symptom of overpopulation, right? This idea that the issue is that there are too many people on the planet. And frankly, that notion is ridiculous because the climate crisis is in fact a symptom of gross inequality. A global report last year found that the richest 1% of people account for the same emissions as the poorest 66%. No one wants to talk about this, particularly in the global north. It's easier to kind of point the finger at countries like, India and China. The insinuation, frankly, being that some lives are worth more than others. And we can take a very direct example from the UK, where I live. Last year, the government approved Rosebank, which is the largest untapped oil and gas field, among other oil and gas licenses that they approved. And Rosebank alone will produce the same emissions of 28 low-income countries, home to 700 million people. Countries including Uganda, Ethiopia, Mozambique, countries that are most vulnerable to the climate crisis. And it's not as if, the wealth of projects such as Rosebank are then redistributed to the people in countries like the UK. In the first half of 2023, over 8 million people in the UK had to borrow money in order to afford their energy bills. So when we're talking about the climate crisis being a product of inequality, we're not just talking about global inequality between the global north and the global south, between countries. We're talking about deeply seated inequality within countries as well. And, the corporations and companies that profit off this inequality, they tend to laugh in the faces of the most vulnerable people. Just last week we had the CEO of Exxon, one of the 5 countries that profited, $200 billion in 2022, coming out and saying, actually, it's not the fossil fuel industry that is responsible for the climate crisis, it's everyday people, because they're unwilling to pay more for green energy. And so, again, we see that these corporations are directly profiting off this inequality. And it's not just oil and gas companies, it's across different industries. So when we're talking about the climate crisis, we have to talk about, the intersecting inequalities of all of the relating issues, from racial injustice and discrimination to gender as well, and understand that injustice and inequality, it's not an accident, it's not a simple product of our human nature. It is a system engineered to profit a tiny number of individuals at the expense of the majority.
Thank you so much for structuring the intersection for us as a starting point for this conversation. I think the intersectional approach that you're pointing to, on the one hand, when it comes to effectiveness, but on the other hand, in the structure of discrimination mechanisms, leads us to much easier grasp what we are actually talking about when it comes to vulnerabilities and effectiveness. And I think you beautifully pointed out, on the one hand, the global perspective, but also the very local perspectives of inequalities that always work under the same intersectional mechanism and structural discrimination mechanism. So I would very much love to bridge to Jeroen Schokkenbroek on this question, because when we talk about the European context, which is a regional context, but in comparison to the local, to the global discourse, yet a very local one, who are the affected minority communities that we are talking about, and how have the recent crises in Europe affected them particularly?
Hello, yes, this works. Thank you very much for your question. It's great to be here. On that, of course, Europe is part of the global north, but the global north is not homogeneous, it's not a uniform. There are huge disparities between countries, within countries, as we know, though, and it means that inequalities pre-exist in our societies, and we know that too well. Now, in the Council, we have founded the governments, the Committee of Ministers has acknowledged officially that crises, first COVID, now the general environmental climate crisis, make existing inequalities more visible, expose them, and even aggravate them. So that phenomena has been clear, for example, in communities like Roma communities in Europe. When COVID broke out, we have huge joint programs with the European Union together to promote the social and integration and inclusion of Roma communities locally in many European countries. And right after the crisis, the health crisis started, we had to adapt, to transform that into almost humanitarian aid style approaches to make sure that basic things like access to sanitation, to hygiene, and so it was made available for these communities. Things that are not self-evident, because we found that some local authorities realized that if there's no running water, there's no point in advising the citizens to regularly wash your hands during the COVID crisis. So you have to adapt and to take special measures to do that. We have come across a situation in Italy where the national equality body, UNAR, has indicated to us that thanks to working with local associations, they found out that there was an unintended ethnic bias in some of the local restrictions on freedom of movement for Roma communities. They had to get out of their settlements to get access to the health services and hygiene services they needed, but were restricted by imposition of movement measures. So there are a wide range of examples where there are impacts that hit harder certain communities. But not only minorities, also the majority, that is women, we know quite well. And there is a very authoritative report of UN Women of last year showing that crises such as those, including the climate crisis, has disproportionately effects on women in the world. Those are all reasons for us to focus on these categories and these groups. And I can say a bit more on how we do that in the next round.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for pointing out that there is not only the inequality that stays upright, but through crisis there's also an acceleration and aggravation that is happening, and the exposure and the vulnerability actually expands. So when we think about mechanisms, how to tackle that, Elena, Kountouri, Tapiero, I'd very much like to hear from you. What are actionable recommendations to effectively tackle those inequalities and foster inclusion and sustainability, and somehow, on a long term, in a sustainable action plan, create some certain resilience?
Very much, thank you for this opportunity to address the Human Rights, the Fundamental Rights Forum, organized by FRA. So just to go back to basics, when we speak about inequalities, I mean, the human rights are universal, and of course they apply to everyone all over the world. And it's also important to draw the links between different rights, because we spoke earlier about the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which was recognized by the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. But it's also useful to think, what does it take to make that right enforceable? It means for an individual to be able to go to a national court and claim the right, claim compensation because the right has been breached. And therefore, I think it's important to think of the connections with other rights, such as the right to life, the right to water. Without water, there is no life. The right to food, the right to live in a non-toxic environment, the right to clean air. So all the rights are, we say they are interconnected and interdependent, and this is the actual meaning of it. But to come back to the inequalities and what we can do to address inequalities, our office works on especially working with environmental human rights defenders. And we see that a great number of them are at risk of reprisals, of imprisonment, and even death. In 2022, there are statistics that more than 446 environmental human rights defenders died as a result of their action, and 34 disappeared. And this is unacceptable because part of the fundamental human right is the right to information, the right to participation, and also the right to be free from reprisals for the exercising your freedom of expression or your freedom of assembly. And therefore we act on 3 levels. So we ask governments to acknowledge the contribution of human rights defenders and acknowledge the important work that they do. We set up networks whereby environmental human rights defenders can have the space to express themselves and act. And on a 3rd level, we try to ensure that there is a safe space for these activists and defenders to be able to work, meaning to be able to protect them when they suffer reprisals, not only for themselves, but also for their families and their loved ones. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for, on the one hand, pointing to the interdependence of rights, but also turning that productively into a tool to empower right holders to actually enforce their very human rights towards governments, towards all kinds of institutional entities, and then also to pointing out that the vulnerability is not always only a structural one, but it can also be a very targeted one, and that those kind of vulnerabilities and exposures might also need different approaches, and that one of those transformative approaches is organization, and organization in creating spaces that then can be translated into different languages and also can kind of encounter in different forms of communication where the expertise is being drawn upon and made productive while still safeguarding the integrity and the safety of those human rights defenders. So Jeroen Schokkenbroek, if we think about diversity-rooted approaches in solution finding to climate-related injustice, taking in consideration that very expertise, that very big pool of engagement and also time and resources that is made free within civic spaces, how can that be taken in consideration when it comes to policymaking?
It strikes us that when it comes to the climate crisis, environmental crisis, there is, of course, extensive guidance, scientific research, knowledge available, legally binding instruments. There is big funding for climate action. But there is actually not so much in terms of promoting inclusive climate action. There's a bit of a blind spot has been for this, and I think it's high time to correct that. Now, we as Kountouri, we don't have the ready-made answer to that, but we have worked on some issues that actually can, in my view, be the basis for also developing a more inclusive approach to climate action. We promote intercultural integration, especially at the local level in our member states, working with migrants, with minority groups, to promote equality for all, to promote more inclusive societies, provide more effective protection against discrimination, and thereby creating more stronger, more resilient societies. Now, in our view, sustainable development should actually build on what we call the diversity advantage at the local level. It is a strength to be diverse in local societies and in national societies. If you allow meaningful intercultural interaction and actually engage people from different communities, from different groups. Circular economic models are, of course, sustainable economic models, but they are not necessarily inclusive. There is more needed for that. So the circle should actually embrace everybody, if I may say so. Now, what are the recommendations that we do have for our member states, for authorities? Engage with diverse groups is the first one. For example, in agriculture, construction, fisheries, where migrant groups are overrepresented, listen to them, take them on board, literally. Research has shown that diversity boosts creativity when it comes to identifying local solutions, using different experiences and opinions. Acknowledge diversity, don't be afraid, don't shy away from admitting it, from recognizing it. And use it as a tool to identify adaptation and mitigation measures that work. Enhancing integration is the third one. Participation of minority groups in developing climate action initiatives to adaptation, to mitigation, has a two-way advantage. It promotes social trust, positive interaction, ownership, a sense of belonging in communities, thereby making communities stronger and more resilient. But at the same time, it also generates action by groups that are so far too often forgotten when it comes to seeing them as actors of climate change.
Yeah, thank you very much also to pointing out as diversity not only as an identity marker, but pointing to the diversity of approaches, of knowledges, bringing them together in maybe also facing certain new challenges when it comes to expertises on dealing with labor market changing or with land and agricultural realities changing, if this is something you were maybe pointing to. And I would very much like to transfer to you, Elena, Kountouri, Tapiero. How can we ensure that those policies and initiatives are designed with a diversity or even a critical diversity informed and sensitive approach, considering the disproportionate impacts and this very inequalities that we've been talking about?
Thank you very much. I think what's important is to, when we are designing these strategies or when we are thinking about these policies, we really need to put on a human rights lens, meaning that we need to analyze these decisions through the impact they can have on human rights and then on the rights of all peoples, but especially the ones that are in vulnerable situations. And we spoke about minorities, but there are also indigenous peoples, peoples with different abilities, women, children, and something that our office is working on, and also in collaboration with FRA, is to be able to measure inequality by putting in place, by using the human rights framework and putting in place human rights indicators which will measure the extent of the inequalities so that we can design policies that can address them. And what is critical in that is data and disaggregated data. And this is so disaggregated by sex, ethnicity, gender, age. And this is something that we find very difficult to get. And just last Friday at our office in Brussels, we organized a human rights talk on the right to housing and just transition. And what came out is that it is very difficult to evaluate, for example, the cost of going carbon neutral on the right to housing. Mm-hmm. So who is it that bears the brunt of increased rent, for example, due to transformations that are made to make houses energy efficient? So this is just one example of how the human rights framework, indicators, and data can help us shape policies that will help us to become more green. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think two aspects of what you are saying are very much also relatable to you, Clover Hogan. The one aspect is data as a tool, for finding language and also to finding action in conversation with, for example, not only policymakers, but also the business sector and the economic sector. And the other one is how do we find solutions that do not perpetuate inequalities even further, instead find solutions that take not only diversity-sensitive approaches, but also inclusive approaches, considering all realities as equal.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, when we talk about climate solutions, I think we've heard many of the same types of solutions on repeat. And so often, you know, technology is kind of heralded as the thing that's going to save the day. And yet, as we know, if we don't center social justice and human rights in these solutions, we're going to perpetuate the very inequalities that you were just speaking to. You know, if we take the example of like electric vehicles, right? We've heard so much about EVs over the past few years. And what we've seen is that the massive spike in demand for EVs has led to a massive spike in demand for cobalt, right? And now cobalt is a metal that is majority mined in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And that is a place where, you know, workers' conditions are terrible, where there is effectively a lot of slave labor, where children are often used to mine these minerals and these metals. And so, again, if we're not actually addressing, okay, how do we ensure it's a just transition, and how do we ensure that in creating solutions, we're not just doubling down on the injustices that the climate crisis is creating, we're going to create solutions that actually work for people, and where we can find, we often talk in environmentalism about like unintended consequences. You take an action and there can be all of these really negative repercussions. The flip side of that is co-benefits, right? A little bit like, I'm not a fan of EVs personally. I love, actually how do we make cities that are less car friendly and more pedestrianized, right? How do we promote things like cycling and cycling infrastructure? Because that's not just good for the environment, it's also good for people's health. It lowers the rates of asthma and lung-related diseases. It makes for much more beautiful surroundings as well if we can create much better kind of green spaces. And exactly to your point, it's the same with building. I'm not interested in a company saying, well, we're net zero and carbon positive, blah, 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 if that high-rise is just going to line the pockets of yet another multimillionaire. How are we creating sustainable, affordable housing? How are we retrofitting existing buildings to directly address the growing unhoused population and actually make sure that people have a safe place for refuge?
Yeah, thank you very much. And when we now take all those conclusions that are very much there on the intersections, how do we make them viable? And not only, as I said, towards politics and policymakers, but also towards the economy, who's actually the driving force behind certain developments, and also the one that needs a large group of customers. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think oftentimes, like I've done this accidentally in climate. When it comes to getting public interest and getting people on board, it's so easy to argue for the reasons that you care about, right? To say, well, I'm passionate about climate action for this reason, and so you should care about the same thing. And yet ultimately, we need to meet people where they are. For a family in the UK, for example, who can't afford their energy bills, who are having to decide in winter, do I keep the heating on or do I keep the fridge going so I can cool my insulin, which I need to survive? You can't tell that family, hey, you really need to think about retrofitting your home to be more sustainable, and that's going to cost you an arm and a leg. So we need to meet people exactly where they are. And when we're talking about these policies, talk about how we directly meet the needs of the most vulnerable populations.
Thank you very much. That one makes me want to bridge to Jeroen Schokkenbroek. As we talk so much about data and evaluation, how do we actually measure and evaluate the effectiveness of climate action initiatives in reducing these inequalities and promoting social and environmental sustainability and maybe also justice? And what are the parameters of this data collection and reporting?
Very difficult question. I'm not a social scientist. I'm a lawyer, a human rights lawyer. I think Elena already helpfully indicated the work on indicators, which is extremely important. I think what I can say, from my experience, I'll give a more global answer to that. I already stress the importance of participation and in terms of including communities, vulnerable groups, groups most directly exposed and affected. That is true, that is important for two reasons. It's important to get better and more effective policies, more effective measures, but also as a tool for empowerment, for creating stronger, more resilient society where there's more solidarity between different parts of society. So when it comes to measuring impact on inequality, on reducing inequalities, I would say measuring participation is a very important indicator, should be a very important indicator. If I may say something a bit more general, in previous debates today, I've heard several times the need for more empathy, the need for more solidarity. And I fully concur with that. What we see at the moment is not only accumulation of crisis in terms of COVID, the environment, climate, war that has returned to Europe with the aggression by Russia against Ukraine, but we also see a democratic crisis that was mentioned at the opening session today. Now that means that actually democracy is being threatened. Our values are put under pressure. And I think for that reason too, equality is extremely important to fight hate speech, to fight hate crimes, to fight discrimination, to make sure that we are all on board. I don't think we should be totally naive. I think the climate crisis has the potential, in theory, to be a great unifier, a binder, in the sense that we're all in the same boat. whether you're rich or poor, the climate crisis is of such a magnitude, it overwhelms us as humanity as a whole. But at the same time, let's not be naive. We are on the same boat, but to continue the metaphor, if the ship starts sinking, there's often a tendency to go for selfishness. Me first, and then I save myself first, and then we'll see about the others. So the need for solidarity is absolutely key, and I think there the language of human rights literacy in the previous panel was mentioned. The language of equality is absolutely crucial to keep our societies, to keep our people, our humankind together.
Can I jump in there quickly? Just on that point around solidarity, it's so important that as a climate movement as well, we ensure that we're centering the lived experience of most vulnerable populations, and that is true of environmental disasters. It's also true of humanitarian crises. We're currently seeing an absolutely devastating humanitarian crisis in what's happening in Gaza. We've, since October 7th, 30,000 people have been killed, majority women and children, 70,000 injured. In the years preceding that, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians forcibly displaced, tortured, persecuted. And so as a climate movement, we need to ensure that we're calling for a ceasefire now, an immediate and sustained ceasefire for Palestinians, for people in Gaza, and ensure constantly that we're not choosing to ignore certain groups of people, certain communities, and we're ensuring that always justice is at the heart of our movements.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for pointing to these very different layers and aspects of solidarity that can be between movements, but also between effectivenesses, and also just acknowledging the multi-crisis and the multiple effectivenesses, especially in crisis, especially in regions of war. Elena, I would like to maybe point to you. When we think about international cooperation as maybe a consequence emerging from something that as empathy or solidarity sometimes feels rather ephemeral or sensory, how does this translate into action, in actual maybe international collaboration or transdisciplinary collaboration, or maybe also unexpected new ways of collaboration in rethinking the models that we are operating in?
Thank you very much. The issue of international cooperation and solidarity, both are principles of international law, so I just want to make clear that we're not speaking about charity or, of course, empathy comes into it, but these are obligations that states have undertaken to be able to live in a world that of course, is interconnected, and the crisis an environmental crisis doesn't stay in one country. Pollution goes across borders. So I just wanted to point out that the Special Rapporteur on the human rights to a clean environment, he gave us statistics that 59 out of 63 countries that are the most vulnerable to climate crisis are also in a situation of debt distress. So going back to the international financial systems and the international financial architecture, if we think of these countries that are struggling to repay debt to international institutions and private investors, which represents a huge part of their revenue, the taxes that we all pay, then, and if it represents more than 50% of that available income, then it means that very little is left to invest in food security systems, in social security that can catch the most vulnerable, in preventing or mitigating the effect of climate change. So I think when we speak about the need to reform our international financial architecture or institutions, we also need to look at this differentiated impact that the financial system has on lower income countries or developing countries compared to developed countries. Thank you.
Yeah, I hear you very much pointing out to the fact that it's not only the interconnectedness and also the interdependence when it comes to the affectedness, but also to the dependence when it comes to financial dependence and some sort of, I mean, I think in the activist circles it's oftentimes also pointed to as reparations. Also, we are now missing the perspective from the African continent, but also there it's the question of how post and neo-colonial realities play into the discussion when it comes to finding a solution that is maybe more sustainable. We do actually have participation from the audience, partly from within the room and partly from online, and I would very much like to throw some of the questions into the round and would maybe like to start with the first one from Robbie Staculum, coming from a social platform, saying that Clover mentioned existing inequalities. Some climate laws disproportionately impact low-income and vulnerable groups. What can be done to tackle those very inequalities? Are you willing to answer?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Robbie. The first thing I would say is that we have to accept that we're not going to solve the climate crisis with the same people and the same institutions and types of thinking that created it. And many of the structures and institutions that we're kind of trusting to solve the climate crisis have been very deeply corrupted by the very players that benefit from the system remaining unchanged. A really simple example is the COP process, right, which I've been going to since I was 15. The Conference of Parties, every year, world leaders coming together to actually negotiate climate commitments. Last year at COP28, there were over 2,400 oil and gas lobbyists. 2,400 people lobbying on behalf of the oil and gas industry in what is meant to be a neutral environment. And that is 4 times more than the year before. So places like COP are not immune. And again, we know that people who benefit from the system remaining unchanged are going to throw everything in their power to ensure that they can extract as much as possible from the existing system. And there are a lot of the people who are currently proposing many of the solutions that disproportionately impact the most vulnerable people. So in response to your question, when designing policies, when designing regulation, we need to ensure that the people who are directly affected, this sounds super obvious, right? But it's not the way of politics. The people who are directly affected are in the room, right? We're talking about young people. As a generation, we're going to inherit the worst impacts of the decisions being made today. We're talking about people seeking asylum, refugee communities. It's estimated that by 2050, over 1 billion people will be on the move because of the climate crisis. We're talking about women. You spoke to this earlier. 80% of people affected directly by climate change are women. So we need to ensure that these voices are directly centered, and we're creating the systems and structures to ensure that we're not just paying lip service, we're not just putting them on a platform or on a panel, but they're actually determining the decisions that are affecting our collective future. And finally, not just because these communities are vulnerable, right, and because they're victimized by these systems of oppression, but because they're the best placed to design inclusive intersectional solutions. They have the expertise, they have the lived experience, they know what it's like to be failed by the existing systems. And so it is their ingenuity, their creativity, and their innovation that we need to center.
Thank you very, very much. For also wrapping this up so condensedly. It kind of also leads us to the second question, to one of the second questions on the screen, which is how's the EU concretely addressing this very intertwined issues of environment, consumerism, and inequality to fight socio-economic challenges? I think some of it has been mentioned already in taking in consideration and acknowledging those diverse expertises and groups, but maybe there is some best practice or specific example that you, Jeroen Schokkenbroek, would like to go into.
Well, I think the question is addressed to the EU, not to the Council of Europe. So, but perhaps Commissioner Šuica, if she joins us later, will speak to that. But clearly, there is a need, at least in the Council of Europe, we see a need for having a holistic approach to this. When it comes, of course, consumerism is not an objective or a target of the Council of Europe. What we are about is protecting human rights, including social rights, including environmental rights, including civil and political rights, including freedom of speech. Without freedom of expression, we heard earlier the artist, how important it is to give a voice to, like we are doing today. For us, it is really within our remit as a human rights, democracy, rule of law organization. That's how we address, and that's already a rather large framework to address these issues. We are, in the Secretary General this morning mentioned the summit that took place last year in Reykjavik, which has actually given a mandate to the organization to focus more on the environment, on the climate crisis, than we have so far. And I think that is a good thing. But it's not easy because we'll have to mobilize all different perspectives in the Council of Europe. I'm the director for equal rights and dignity. There are others dealing with freedom of the media, others dealing with access to justice. So the whole range of human rights work of the Council of Europe will need to be mobilized.
Thank you very much. I think it was a really valuable also translation into the mechanisms that are in place on a legal level. And I think that's really also the asset of having the diversity of different languages and expressions here. How do we translate between the different institutional logics and mechanisms, and how can, as you were pointing to earlier, certain rights and also indicators be translated also when it comes to recommendations, to regulation mechanisms, and also to the enforcement of the classical human rights alphabet. We happen to find out that our guest is joining us. Sorry, I'm lost for one tiny little second, but it's our great pleasure for Dubravka Šuica, the Vice President for Democracy and Demography of the European Commission, has found an opportunity to join us. Thank you very much for jumping into the discussion. Welcome. Do you hear us?
Sorry for this. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you very well. Thank you very much for...
Okay, sorry for this sorry for these technical issues.
Thank you very much for joining us. We're deep in the discussion on the intersection of climate injustice and social inequalities, tackling it from all kinds of different perspectives, from the activist one, from the human rights one, from the legal framework one, and we're starting to incorporate questions from the audience, and some of them were already pointing to EU mechanisms, and we would just love to invite you to maybe share your perspective on the respective panel.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, and let me say a few words for the beginning. You know that the European Green Deal has set in motion the transformation of our society and of our economy, and that this transition can only succeed with the buy-in involvement of the public. We need to make sure the policy actions relate and deliverable tangible benefit of the European society at large. Ultimately, this shouldn't be a difficult sell, as next to fighting climate change, it will improve people's lives. With new green jobs, better insulated homes, infrastructure better prepared for extreme weather, more green spaces in cities and less waste, cleaner air and water, healthier food, our health, well-being and finance will improve and our society will prosper. Most people are already concerned about the climate crisis and are willing to act to fight against it. And the European Union-wide survey we carried out last year showed that 93% of people think that climate change is a serious problem and they consciously make sustainable choices in their daily lives. International surveys show these concerns are shared by people across the world. This is good news. But the challenge is that people underestimate the willingness of their fellow citizens to act. This perception gap and the fact that many will only act if they see others taking action remains a considerable obstacle to further climate action. Our task is to raise awareness about the broad European and global support for climate action. One of our key tools to ensure this is the European Climate Pact, a diverse community of individuals and stakeholders from across various sectors in all European member states. These citizens are committed to climate action and contribute to the European Union climate goals. It encourages collaboration, knowledge sharing and exchange exchange of best practices among participants. The pact aims to raise awareness about climate change, foster dialogue, and empower citizens and different organizations to take concrete steps towards reducing their carbon footprint and transitioning to a greener economy. The perspective of children and young people is crucial to the green transition. It is our next generation that will bear the impact of climate change. Their voices should be heard loud and clear in the public debate about tackling the climate crisis. After all, in Europe especially, it is their activism that has put climate action at the top of political agenda. Under the pact, we have organized events, participatory activities, and youth dialogues. Hundreds of young climate pact ambassadors promote climate action among young people on the ground and thus supporting their local activities. Beyond that, we have, under my steer, developed a number of innovative citizen engagement tools, such as the Conference on the Future of Europe, but also as a follow-up, European citizens panels. And these panels were one of the many ideas that we are implementing inspired by our citizens. And they will now become a permanent feature in our institutional policy-making process. Also, responding to children's call for greater engagement in the decision-making process and in also democratic life, we have created a European children's participation platform. Dear ladies and gentlemen, concerted action on climate change means making intergenerational solidarity a reality, and we need to act together with all our citizens, including the youngest, to join forces across the entire life cycle to preserve this planet for present and future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Dubravka Šuica, for picking up so many things that are already flying around in the room and condensing them also in pointing out the tool and the manifestation of those approaches within the European Climate Pact. That seems to be really addressing all those very many different aspects that we've been talking about, finding a diverse approach, finding an approach for civic engagement, finding mechanisms of knowledge transfer, and making solidarity and collaboration not only something like empathy or emotion, but actually translating it into action. So this is really only what we can take, is that collaboration, and actually consequent collaboration that is action-based, that is sustainable on all levels, that is diverse, that is inclusive, is the only solution that we have to something that is beyond urgent, that is already shaping so many realities. But there is many, many important initiatives, and this kind of conversations can only be a beginning to many things that are happening, not in these spaces, but out there. So thank you very much for partaking in this conversation. Thank you for joining us. And another warmer applause for this round. And yeah, let's resume. Yeah, sorry, I had something in my ear. So yeah, let's really try to make an effort together. And thank you very much for being here. Thanks. So, Mrs. Vice President, thank you for joining us from afar in this case. It is my pleasure to introduce the next and also last activity on the stage for today and tonight, which is an art project, but also maybe an art project presentation to a certain degree, operating in a field that I'm very at home at, especially when it comes to the translation to cinema. So it's my dearest pleasure to welcome on stage Jolene Walhoff from Water Bear. Please join me.